What if the collapse everyone fears in emerging markets is not a distant possibility, but a process already halfway complete, accelerating quietly while most people still believe their countries are stable enough to avoid disaster? When you look closely at Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, a disturbing pattern emerges, almost like a mathematical script repeating itself across decades and continents. These nations followed different paths, cultures, and political systems, yet they all converged toward the same critical point, the moment when economic strain, political fatigue, and social fragmentation merge into a single breaking pressure. The signs were there long before the headlines noticed them. Signals hidden in rising debt, institutional decay, currency devaluation, and the slow erosion of productive capacity. But the real question is, why so many still refuse to acknowledge the pattern when the evidence is so unmistakable? For years, these countries believed their natural resources, demographic strength, or strategic relevance would shield them from structural decline. But history has shown that empires and economies rarely collapse from a single blow. They decay from within, silently, through thousands of tiny fractures that accumulate until one final shock exposes everything. In emerging markets, these fractures appear earlier and grow faster because the foundational institutions are younger, weaker, or more politically compromised. It is not a matter of ideology, geography, or leadership style. It is the predictable outcome of a system reaching the limits of its economic and political endurance. And now that these nations have reached stage 5 of the collapse pattern, the consequences are becoming visible: declining trust, rising social anger, shrinking investment, and governments improvising instead of governing. These are not symptoms of temporary crises, but markers of structural transition. Once a country reaches this depth of the cycle, the pressure intensifies, momentum builds, and decisions made decades earlier begin to bear consequences that can no longer be delayed or ignored. You may even recognize some of these signals in your own country, subtle at first, then increasingly hard to dismiss. Have you ever felt like everything is becoming more unstable, more fragile, as if the system is straining under a weight no one wants to name? If this resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding this pattern is the first step to seeing reality clearly. And if the content helps you make sense of what is happening, leave a like and check if you are already subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the next parts of this investigation, as what comes next may reveal even more about how deep this pattern truly goes, leading us directly into the next stage without ever saying it aloud. As the pattern becomes clearer, something even more unsettling emerges. The speed at which emerging markets move from hidden stress to visible instability is far faster than what people expect. Once the internal pressures begin to align, the cycle accelerates because these economies are structurally more exposed to global shocks. Brazil, South Africa, and Russia all experience periods of optimism driven by commodity booms, foreign capital inflows, and the illusion that rapid growth meant structural strength. But growth built on volatile foundations does not create resilience. It simply masks the underlying weaknesses until the external environment changes, and then the cracks widen all at once. To understand why this acceleration happens, you need to look at how these nations experienced the last 20 years. During moments of global liquidity, they expanded aggressively, borrowing heavily, subsidizing consumption, and relying on short-term political fixes to deliver prosperity. Instead of reinvesting windfalls into long-term capacity, they allowed inefficiencies to become permanent and corruption to absorb the margins meant for transformation. When the global cycle shifted, they were not prepared for the consequences. The slowdown did not just reduce growth, it exposed how dependent they were on conditions they could not control, creating the exact environment where the collapse pattern gains momentum. Another factor fueling this acceleration is the erosion of internal cohesion. In emerging markets, institutions often lack the durability that mature economies developed. Over centuries, judicial systems are slower, regulatory bodies are politically influenced, and public trust is easier to fracture. This means that once economic pressures rise, political polarization intensifies rapidly. Social groups lose patience faster, political movements become more radical, and the middle class, already strained, begins to withdraw confidence from the system. The breakdown is not sudden, it is cumulative, like weight pressing on structural beams that were never designed to hold it. What seems like isolated event scandals, currency swings, investor flight, rising unrest, is actually the manifestation of the same deeper sequence unfolding. Even the leadership in these countries often misreads the cycle, interpreting early warnings as temporary turbulence instead of structural deterioration. By the time they acknowledge the scale of the problem, the system has already shifted into a stage where conventional solutions no longer slow the decline. And as the pressures continue tightening, the consequences of past decisions start aligning into a chain reaction that will eventually connect to the next phase, where external forces and internal weaknesses merge into something far more destabilizing. As the internal pressures intensify, another layer of the collapse pattern becomes unavoidable. The growing weight of external forces shaping the destiny of emerging markets. Brazil, South Africa, and Russia do not operate in isolation. They sit at the intersection of global financial flows, geopolitical rivalries, and commodity dependencies that expose them to risks far greater than their own internal struggles. When the world's major powers shift strategy, adjust interest rates, or redirect trade networks, these countries feel the shock first and the shock hardest. The fragility was always there, but it becomes undeniable once these external triggers begin reinforcing the weaknesses already spreading through their institutions. The most powerful of these external forces is the tightening grip of global capital. For years, emerging markets relied on foreign investment to sustain growth, balance deficits, and maintain political optimism. But capital flows are never loyal. They move to safety the moment uncertainty rises. When investors sense instability, they withdraw not slowly, but in synchronized waves. This sudden flight drains liquidity, devalues currencies, and forces governments into desperate measures that often accelerate the decline. In many ways, emerging markets are trapped in a cycle where they must constantly attract capital to survive, yet the very dependence on that capital ensures they remain vulnerable to collapse when conditions shift. Geopolitical pressures add another layer to this spiral. Russia faces sanctions and diplomatic isolation that weaken its domestic economy and limit its strategic options. South Africa, caught between Western interests and rising influence from China, experiences constant external tension that complicates internal governance. Brazil navigates pressure from trade partners, global commodity swings, and shifting alliances that leave it exposed whenever political instability rises at home. These nations are not only battling their own internal fractures, they are also being squeezed by global systems designed around the priorities of stronger, more stable powers. Even trade dynamics become part of the pattern. When global demand weakens, commodity-dependent economies experience immediate contraction. Prices fall, revenues shrink, debts grow, and currencies lose value. Each of these consequences amplifies the next, creating a self-reinforcing loop that tightens as the global cycle turns. What appears to be a simple downturn is actually the beginning of a deeper structural convergence. External shocks interacting with internal decay, pushing these countries further into the collapse pattern without offering any path to reverse the momentum. And as these pressures build, the leaders of these nations often underestimate the speed and intensity with which the global environment can shift. By the time they react, the mechanisms shaping their economies are already locked into a trajectory that has become almost impossible to redirect, setting the stage for the next layer of internal rupture that emerges once society begins to feel the consequences directly. As external pressures intensify, the internal fabric of emerging markets begins to tear in ways that are harder to hide, harder to dismiss, and far harder to reverse. Institutions that once held society together start losing authority, not because they suddenly changed, but because people stop believing they are capable of delivering stability. In Brazil, courts face accusations from all sides, transforming justice into a battlefield of narratives rather than a foundation of order. In South Africa, public trust erodes as state agencies struggle with corruption, inefficiency, and fading credibility. In Russia, the centralization of power creates an illusion of stability, but beneath it, the gap between authority and legitimacy widens with every economic setback and every tightening of political control. This erosion does not happen overnight. It grows in silence until it becomes impossible to ignore. Citizens begin questioning whether the system still represents them or simply manages their frustration. Businesses hesitate to invest because they no longer trust the rules. Professionals leave their careers or emigrate in search of environments where institutions still function. And as this slow-motion breakdown accumulates, the social contract starts to weaken, not from a single dramatic event, but from the daily feeling that the system is slipping out of sync with the needs of the people it was built to serve. Emerging markets are especially vulnerable because their institutional frameworks were constructed under constant economic and political pressure. When stability declines, fragmentation rises. Groups retreat into identity, region, ideology, or class. Cooperation becomes harder. Consensus becomes rare, and every political dispute escalates faster than the one before it. What was once a disagreement becomes an existential fight, because every side feels that losing means being left behind in a country that no longer protects them. This is the moment when even small shocks create outsized reactions. A policy announcement sparks protests. A currency drop ignites panic. A corruption scandal deepens polarization. Nothing happens in isolation anymore. Every event echoes through a population already stretched to its emotional limit. When society senses that institutions are failing, uncertainty becomes its own force, transforming fear into a driver of instability that accelerates the collapse pattern even further. As institutions weaken and uncertainty spreads, another force begins shaping the trajectory of emerging markets, the slow, grinding loss of productive capacity that leaves countries increasingly dependent on external systems they cannot control. This erosion is subtle at first, hidden beneath short-term growth cycles or temporary periods of optimism. But over time, the underlying decline becomes impossible to ignore. Brazil once relied on industrial strength and agricultural dominance, yet decades of inconsistent policy, commodity dependence, and infrastructure decay have chipped away at competitiveness. South Africa, once the industrial engine of the African continent, faces energy shortages, collapsing public services, and an economy struggling to maintain the basic conditions necessary for growth. Russia, heavily tied to resource extraction, finds itself trapped in a cycle where energy revenues substitute for genuine diversification, masking vulnerabilities that deepen with every global shift. When productive capacity weakens, a country loses more than economic strength. It loses strategic autonomy. The ability to manufacture, innovate, and sustain domestic industries becomes essential during periods of global stress. Yet emerging markets often reach stage 5 precisely when their productive base is most fragile. Investments shrink, skilled workers emigrate, infrastructure deteriorates, and entire sectors become dependent on foreign suppliers. Once this dependence grows, the collapse pattern accelerates because the country no longer controls the inputs needed to stabilize itself. A supply chain disruption, a credit downgrade, or a shift in global demand ripples through the economy with amplified force, revealing how exposed the system has become. This deterioration also affects the psychological foundation of the economy. Businesses lose confidence in long-term planning. Entrepreneurs hesitate to build. Banks prefer short-term lending over productive investment. Governments respond with reactive policies that temporarily ease pressure but fail to reverse the decline. Over time, productivity drops, not due to lack of potential, but because every part of the system becomes conditioned to operate defensively. The entire economic engine shifts from expansion to survival mode. And once an economy is stuck in this defensive posture, social expectations shift as well. Citizens begin to sense that growth is no longer a guarantee, but a distant memory. They adapt to scarcity, accept lower standards, and internalize instability as part of everyday life. This mindset becomes another hidden mechanism, pushing the collapse pattern forward. Because when a population stops believing in upward mobility, the energy that once fueled development turns into resignation. And it is in this atmosphere of stagnation that the next stage of the pattern begins tightening its grip, preparing to merge economic weakness with the broader systemic pressures that are already reshaping the future of these nations. As productive capacity weakens and economies transition into a defensive posture, a new and more dangerous dynamic emerges: the simultaneous deterioration of currency stability, public debt sustainability, and core infrastructure. These forces do not decline independently. They reinforce one another, forming a feedback loop that tightens the collapse pattern and accelerates the descent into stage 6. For emerging markets, this convergence is especially destructive because their financial systems are more sensitive to global shifts, and their political institutions are less equipped to handle prolonged stress. When a country's currency begins to lose value, the effects ripple outward with alarming speed. Import costs rise, investor confidence falls, and governments must choose between defending the currency with scarce reserves or allowing it to weaken further. Brazil has faced repeated episodes where currency volatility triggered inflation spikes that destabilized household budgets and undermined policy credibility. South Africa experiences similar swings, where even modest global disruptions send the rand into sudden decline. Russia, despite efforts to maintain control, finds its currency tied to geopolitical pressures that overshadow domestic policy decisions. Each movement reflects deeper vulnerabilities that cannot be corrected through short-term interventions. Currency instability, in turn, affects the nation's ability to manage its debt. As borrowing costs rise and refinancing becomes more expensive, governments are forced into increasingly fragile fiscal strategies. Debt servicing absorbs a larger share of public spending, leaving less room for investment in growth or social stability. Infrastructure, already strained by years of underinvestment, begins to deteriorate more quickly. Energy grids fail, transportation systems decay, and essential public services become unreliable. These failures are not isolated technical problems. They are symptoms of a system losing its structural capacity to support modern economic life. The deterioration of infrastructure amplifies the debt spiral. When power grids are unstable, industries slow down. When transportation networks degrade, supply chains break. When public services falter, productivity collapses. Governments try to compensate by increasing spending, often financed by new debt, which further pressures the currency. What begins as a financial challenge evolves into a full-spectrum crisis that touches every part of daily life, transforming inconvenience into chronic dysfunction. In this environment, ordinary shocks become catalysts for widespread disruption. A temporary power outage leads to production losses that ripple across sectors. A small increase in interest rates abroad triggers capital flight. A minor political dispute escalates because the public senses that the system is already stretched to its limits. It is in this convergence, currency instability, rising debt and crumbling infrastructure, that emerging markets begin to experience the unmistakable tightening of the collapse pattern, setting the stage for the next accelerating force that reshapes how the elites, investors, and entire social groups respond as pressure continues to build. As the financial pressure intensifies and infrastructure begins to falter, another force enters the pattern with even greater weight: the behavior of the elites who control capital, influence policy, and shape the emotional tone of the nation. In every emerging market that reaches stage 5, the reactions of those at the top accelerate the decline far more than the crises themselves. When the elite class senses instability, they do not wait for public confirmation. They respond early, quietly, and decisively, shifting their wealth into foreign assets, diversifying into offshore accounts, or relocating investments into safer jurisdictions. What begins as a strategic precaution gradually becomes a drain on national resilience, pulling liquidity, talent, and confidence out of the country at the moment it needs them most. In Brazil, capital flight historically rises during political turbulence, creating a cycle where wealthy individuals withdraw funds precisely when the economy requires reinforcement. In South Africa, the ongoing uncertainty around governance, energy stability, and institutional direction has led many high-net-worth individuals to emigrate, taking not only wealth, but also technical knowledge and entrepreneurial capacity with them. Russia faces a different but equally destabilizing pattern. Sanctions, political isolation, and tightening control have pushed elites to disperse assets abroad while publicly projecting loyalty. In each case, the elite response becomes part of the structural pressure, not a reaction to it. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is the psychological shift it triggers. When ordinary citizens observe the wealthiest people hedging against the future, mistrust grows. Confidence in recovery fades. The belief that the system still has time to correct itself weakens. Businesses scale back plans, young professionals look for opportunities abroad, and the middle class, already strained, begins to question whether staying is a rational long-term decision. The economy doesn't collapse solely because of numbers. It collapses because belief erodes, and belief is the foundation that keeps societies functioning during moments of stress. This loss of confidence also transforms political dynamics. Governments, sensing the erosion of elite support, often respond with reactive policies, new controls, symbolic reforms, or rhetoric meant to project strength. But these measures typically backfire because they signal vulnerability instead of stability. Investors interpret them as warnings. Citizens experience them as evidence that authority is weakening. And as elites continue distancing themselves from the national economy, the feedback loop grows stronger. Declining confidence fuels more capital flight, which fuels more instability, which accelerates the collapse pattern further. As elites withdraw and the internal foundations weaken, another revealing layer of the collapse pattern becomes visible. The striking similarities between emerging markets that, on the surface, appear to have little in common, Brazil, South Africa, and Russia occupy different regions, operate under different political models, and face distinct historical legacies. Yet once they reach stage 5, their trajectories begin to converge with an almost mathematical precision. The same signals appear in different languages, the same tensions surface under different ideologies, and the same structural failures unfold despite opposing narratives. This is not coincidence. It is the pattern revealing itself in full clarity. For Brazil, the recurring cycles of optimism, followed by disillusionment, have created a society accustomed to volatility but increasingly exhausted by it. Political swings intensify economic uncertainty, and each attempt to correct past mistakes is constrained by institutional fragility that erodes public trust. South Africa, meanwhile, grapples with deep social divides and the long shadow of historical inequality. The institutions designed to unify the nation face mounting strain as economic stagnation spreads and public services decay. Russia presents yet another variation of the same structure. Centralized power that once created the appearance of stability now becomes a bottleneck, preventing adaptation and magnifying the consequences of external pressure. Despite these differences, the pressures operating beneath the surface act in remarkably similar ways. In each of these nations, currency instability creates a psychological shift where citizens begin measuring their future in terms of risk rather than opportunity. Debt burdens restrict policy options, making reforms slow and reactive instead of strategic. Infrastructure failures, whether through power shortages or deteriorating transportation networks, disrupt the rhythm of daily life and quietly reshape expectations about what the state can deliver. These shared mechanisms expose how fragile the balance becomes when multiple structural weaknesses begin reinforcing one another. The social response across these countries also follows a comparable path. As the middle class loses confidence, political polarization deepens. Populist narratives gain traction not because they offer solutions, but because they channel frustration into something that feels like clarity. Protests become more frequent, not necessarily larger, but more emotionally charged. People begin thinking less about reforming the system and more about abandoning it, physically, economically, or psychologically. Migration rises, investment slows, cynicism becomes the default worldview, filling the space where national ambition once lived. Even the rhetoric of leadership begins to resemble one another. Promises of renewal turn into appeals for patience. Calls for unity shift toward warnings about loyalty. Economic plans are increasingly framed around managing decline rather than building growth. And as these patterns synchronize across countries separated by oceans and cultures, it becomes clear that emerging markets are not experiencing isolated crises. They are advancing through the same structural stages that have defined collapses throughout history, moving toward a future shaped less by national identity and more by the mathematical pressures driving the next phase of decline. As these similarities sharpen and the pattern becomes unmistakable, one final question emerges. Why do emerging markets collapse faster than the great powers that came before them? The answer lies not in culture or geography, but in structural velocity. Emerging markets operate in a global ecosystem where every shock arrives amplified, every dependency becomes a pressure point, and every delay in reform multiplies the cost of inaction. Unlike historical empires that decayed over decades, modern nations are wired into financial systems, supply chains, and geopolitical alliances that react instantly to instability. The margin for error is smaller, the timeline is shorter, and the consequences are far more immediate. In Brazil, shifts in global interest rates or commodity prices can trigger currency slides within days, affecting inflation, wages, and public sentiment almost instantly. South Africa faces similar vulnerabilities. Even minor disruptions in energy supply or investment confidence cascade into nationwide consequences because the system lacks buffers to absorb shocks. Russia, though more insulated in some areas, experiences accelerated responses as well. Geopolitical tensions, sanctions, and global market shifts translate into rapid domestic adjustments that expose underlying fragilities. These nations do not experience decline gradually. They experience it in jolts, each one pushing the system further into the collapse mechanism. Part of this acceleration is rooted in expectations. Emerging markets often promise growth, mobility, and rapid improvement. When these promises fail, the psychological backlash is fiercer than in nations where stagnation has already been internalized. Citizens shift quickly from optimism to skepticism, from patience to frustration, and this emotional compression intensifies political cycles. Leaders respond with improvisation, short-term measures, or symbolic gestures that buy time but deepen long-term instability. Each political shift disrupts investment, weakens institutions, and accelerates the loss of confidence that fuels the collapse. Another accelerating force is demographic and social pressure. Young populations in emerging markets demand opportunity, stability, and mobility. When these expectations collide with structural decline, tensions rise faster than governments can manage. Protests grow more frequent, social fragmentation deepens, and the political environment becomes increasingly reactive. In this climate, every policy misstep becomes a catalyst, every scandal becomes a spark. Every external shock finds a population already pushed near its limit. But perhaps the most decisive factor accelerating collapse is the absence of stabilizing anchors. Great powers historically relied on industrial dominance, military reach, or reserve currency privilege to slow their decline. Emerging markets have none of these shields. They depend on external financing, imported technology, and global trade networks that turn hostile the moment instability appears. Their decline is not cushioned. It is exposed, raw, and shaped by forces they cannot negotiate with or control. And as the pressures of currency instability, political fragmentation, capital flight, and institutional weakening converge, these nations move faster toward the edge not because they are weaker, but because the modern world leaves them no room to fall slowly. In this accelerating descent, the final stage begins to take shape, revealing what happens when all these forces merge into a single trajectory that points toward the next unavoidable transformation. As the pressure converges and the trajectory becomes impossible to ignore, the final stage begins to reveal itself not as a dramatic event, but as a subtle transformation that spreads through every layer of society. Emerging markets do not collapse like towers falling in a single moment. They collapse like structures whose foundations have been quietly dissolving for years. The signs are already visible long before the public realizes they are living through a historic shift. Households adapt to instability as if it were normal. Businesses operate with shorter horizons. Governments speak less about growth and more about managing risk. This psychological shift may be the most defining feature of Stage 6, because once a nation internalizes instability, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse the emotional momentum that shapes every decision, every expectation, every attempt to stabilize the system. In Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, this shift becomes clear when people stop asking when things will improve and start asking how to cope with what comes next. Inflation no longer shocks, it fatigues. Currency swings no longer cause panic, they cause resignation. Political scandals no longer outrage, they numb. The collapse pattern does not rely on dramatic collapses in the streets. It relies on the gradual surrender of societal confidence. Once people stop believing the system can turn around, the underlying dynamics accelerate because each new shock meets a population already conditioned to expect decline. This emotional environment creates the perfect opening for the next transformation, whether it takes the form of a new political order, a restructuring of the economy, or a shift into a model shaped not by vision, but by necessity. The tragedy is that by the time a country reaches this stage, the decisions that matter were made decades earlier. Leadership changes may offer new narratives, but they cannot undo the structural forces that have been building momentum for years. Debt burdens cannot be unwound quickly. Institutions cannot be rebuilt overnight, and productive capacity cannot be restored without long-term stability that no longer exists. What emerges instead is a new phase where the nation redefines its identity around limitation rather than possibility, around containment, rather than expansion. It is not the end of the story, but it is the end of an era. If you stayed with me until this point, leave a comment saying this phrase, "I am with you until the end." Your voice matters here. And if this content helped you understand the deeper forces shaping what is happening around us, consider subscribing so you can continue exploring these hidden patterns with me. Leave a like as well. It helps keep this conversation alive. And if you want to go even deeper, there is another video right here that expands on the next layer of this narrative. Click and continue the journey with me there, because what comes after this stage might change how you see the entire global system.